was just another night in my high-rise apartment. I was alone, curled up with a book, trying to make the most of my quiet evening. The view from my window, high above the city streets, was peaceful. It felt like I was in my own little world, far from the noise of everyday life. The building was quiet as usual, with only the faint sounds of the elevator occasionally chiming from the hallway. I didn't think anything was out of the ordinary. That is, until I heard it, a soft knock on my door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was so quiet that for a moment, I thought I imagined it. But then the knock came again, this time a little more insistent. I slowly got up and tiptoed to the door, trying to peer through the peephole. The hallway outside was dimly lit, but I could just make out the shape of a man standing there. His features were obscured by the shadows, and his face was barely visible, which made my stomach tighten in unease. The man didn't speak at first, but then I heard him say, "It's me." His voice sounded strange, as though he was expecting me to recognize him. But I didn't. I didn't know who he was. I felt a chill run down my spine. Who was this person? I didn't answer, too afraid to even speak. I just stood there, pressing my back against the door, hoping he would go away. The knocking continued. It started out soft, but with each passing moment, it became more forceful, more demanding. I stood frozen, not daring to make a sound. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling by my sides. Should I open the door? Was this some kind of prank? But nothing about this situation felt right. I didn't recognize the man, and the fact that he seemed to know me, or at least thought he did, made it even worse. The knocking stopped suddenly, as though the man had given up. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, not moving, afraid to even breathe. I waited for something, anything, but the silence stretched on. After a long pause, I finally moved away from the door, my legs weak beneath me. The air in the apartment felt heavy, as if it had been charged with some unseen energy. I waited for a while before I dared to even check again. The hallway was still. No footsteps, no sound. I cautiously opened the door, just a crack, to look outside, but the hallway was empty. There was no one there. I stepped back, confused and unsettled. Had I imagined it? Had I just been hearing things? But no, the knock had been real. I could still hear the sound of it in my mind. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I locked the door and went back to the couch, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. But the unease wouldn't leave. I couldn't stop thinking about that voice, that strange, "It's me," as if I should have recognized him. But I didn't. I couldn't recall anyone who would say that to me. Who was he? The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made my heart race, and I kept thinking I would hear the knock again. But I didn't. Still, the unease lingered in the back of my mind. Who had been at my door? Why hadn't I seen him when I opened it? The questions were eating at me, keeping me awake, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next morning, I went about my routine, trying to push the events of the previous night out of my mind. But something kept nagging at me. Something wasn't right. I walked past the hallway security camera on my way out, and had an impulse to check the footage. Maybe there was something that I had missed, something that could explain it all. I returned to my apartment later that day, my curiosity gnawing at me. I didn't want to check the footage. I was afraid of what I might find, but I knew I had to. I sat down at my desk, pulled up the security system on my laptop, and started reviewing the footage from the previous night. I scrubbed through the hours, my eyes glued to the screen. It was all normal, quiet, until the timestamp hit around 11:45 p.m., the time I had heard the knocking. There it was. The hallway footage appeared exactly as I remembered it. But the strange part? There was no one at my door. I rewound it and played it again. Still nothing. Just the empty hallway, dimly lit, with no sign of the man who had been standing there only hours before. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as I stared at the footage. How could this be? I had heard the knocking. I had even heard his voice. And yet, there was nothing in the video. I watched the footage over and over again, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. Maybe the camera was malfunctioning, I thought. But that didn't make sense. Everything else had recorded just fine. The timestamp was accurate, confirming the knocking. The video was real. But the man wasn't. It was as if he had never been there. But I knew he had. The fear was creeping in again, this time stronger than before. My hands were shaking as I rewound the footage one last time. I focused on the timestamp, my eyes wide with disbelief as it hit exactly 2 a.m. That's when the knocking had stopped. But the man, whoever he was still nowhere to be seen on the footage. I felt like I was going crazy. Was I imagining it? Had I just lost my mind? But no, I knew what I had heard. It was real. I spent the rest of the night replaying the footage, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. It was as if I was trying to find something, anything, to explain what had happened. But there was nothing. No explanation, no sign of the man. I started to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. The knocking, the voice, had it all been a figment of my imagination? Or was there something else going on? I eventually turned off the laptop, feeling a strange mixture of fear and confusion. I wanted to forget it, pretend it hadn't happened, but I couldn't. The image of that man standing at my door haunted me, and the fact that there was no evidence of him on the footage made it all the more unsettling. It didn't make sense. It didn't feel real. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to the footage, to the man who wasn't there. I wanted to believe it had all been a dream, that I had imagined the whole thing. But I couldn't. The knocking had been too real, too persistent. And the voice that had called out to me, still echoed in my ears. It felt like something was watching me, waiting for me to crack, to fall apart. I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept checking my phone, looking out the window, even glancing nervously over my shoulder when I walked down the hall. The apartment, which had always felt like a safe haven, now seemed oppressive and eerie. Every corner felt like it was hiding something, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being haunted by something I couldn't see. Or maybe something I wasn't supposed to see. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. The knocking, the voice, the footage, it was all stuck in my mind. I started to feel like I was being followed, even when I was alone. There was a constant pressure in the air, an invisible presence that I couldn't escape. It was as though something was in my apartment with me, watching, waiting. One night, I decided to take action. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I couldn't just ignore it any longer. I set up my camera again, this time pointed at the door, to see if anything strange would happen. I didn't want to believe that something was truly wrong, but I had to be sure. The house was quiet, and the darkness outside the window felt like it was closing in on me. I tried to stay calm, but the unease in my chest kept growing. As I sat there, staring at the camera feed, I felt my anxiety skyrocket. The silence was suffocating, and every little creak or crack in the apartment felt amplified. It felt like something was coming, something I wasn't ready for. But nothing happened. The clock ticked on, the minutes stretching into hours, and still, there was no knock, no voice, no shadowy figure standing outside my door. But then around 3:30 a.m., I saw it. A shadow passed by my door. My heart stopped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was the same dark figure, just like the night of the knocking. This time, however, there was no sound. No knock, no voice. Just the figure moving silently past the door. My breath caught in my throat. Who was this person? And why were they still here? I immediately rewound the footage and watched the shadow pass by again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The figure lingered for a moment, just outside the door, before fading into the darkness. I couldn't explain it. There was no noise, no interaction. Just the shadow. But it was enough. The sense of dread I felt earlier returned tenfold. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was far from over. The following morning, I woke up feeling drained, as though the events of the past few days had sucked the life out of me. I felt like I was living in a nightmare that never ended. But when I checked the footage from the night before, there was no sign of the shadowy figure. Nothing at all. The timestamp confirmed it, but there was no visual evidence. The figure hadn't been caught on camera at all. It was as if everything that had been happening was in my head. A part of me wanted to believe it was all a trick of the mind, but the fear still lingered. The strange knocking, the voice, the shadow, it was all too real, even without the proof. I started to wonder if I was going mad, if my mind had simply concocted all of it to make sense of the fear that had taken hold of me. And then just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The knocking, the figure, the voice, nothing happened for days. I began to convince myself that it was over, that whatever had been haunting me had moved on. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right.